Okay, so Rousseau. I'm glad we got to Rousseau. I love Locke, but probably of all the writers we're going to read, my favorite is Rousseau. Um, Rousseau is one of those figures that you see throughout the history of philosophy who I think you could fairly say was a piece of work. He's unquestionably some kind of a genius, but he's also a bit cracked. Um, in fact, he ended his days clinically paranoid, I think. Um, David Hume, the great Scottish philosopher, my candidate for greatest modern philosopher, was a fan of some aspects of Rousseau's work. He was not a fan of what Rousseau says in this about the social contract, as we'll find out when we read Hume's criticisms of the social contract. But he was a fan, in particular, of some of Rousseau's less philosophical work, which is also philosophical. For example, Rousseau was a polymath to some extent. He wrote very popular pieces of music that were performed at the time, operas, I believe he also wrote, and he wrote incredibly successful novels. His most successful novel, I believe, was called Sophie or La Nouvelle Héloïse. His more famous novel these days is Emile, which contains within it theories that he espouses elsewhere about education. It's very much a novel of ideas, and it espouses his ideas about what ideal education should be like. And they're certainly ahead of their time. They're rather what you might call hippie-ish ideas. For example, the kid shouldn't be forced to read before he is ready, which for Rousseau is about age 15. So it's a bit late starting to read. Yeah, so he wrote on all kinds of things, and he wrote voluminously. But he also wrote in this style that is, I find, very readable because it's so sort of florid and over the top. He's very emotional, and you get that idea from the little anecdote that is told about him in the introduction you have in Khan. So yeah, I'll be talking, of course, about the version of Discourse of the Origin of Inequality. That's what this video is about, and the version in this book, Stephen Kahn's second edition of Classics of Moral and Political. I don't like how much Kahn has cut the discourse on the origin of inequality. He's cut out big chunks. Now, you might appreciate that because it's less to read, but I think he's cut out some important stuff. So I'll talk a little bit about some things that are not included in this one. But mostly I will try to refer back to, when I give quotes, I'll refer back to their page numbers in Kahn. Yeah, so the anecdote in the introduction written by Joshua Cohen, who is a very well-respected contemporary political philosopher who has sort of propounded an interpretation of Rousseau that is very much influenced, I think, by the contemporary philosopher John Rawls, who was incredibly influential over the latter half of the 20th century in American political philosophy, a giant. His influence, I think, has waned somewhat in the 21st. But anyway, he was a teacher of Joshua Cohen, and I think Cohen's interpretation of Rousseau rather sort of projects Rawls onto Rousseau. Rawls, of course, was influenced by Rousseau, as all philosophers in the social contract tradition were after Rousseau. Rousseau is a very influential writer. But I'm not sure I agree with everything Cohen says. However, he is a very clear writer. Anyway, he cites a famous incident in Rousseau's life. He's walking from Paris to Vincennes in 1749 and reflecting on a question set by the Academy of Dijon. Yeah, this is the second discourse that Rousseau wrote. The first discourse that he wrote was far more successful than this one. Both of them were responses to questions set by this Academy of Dijon. So it was sort of an essay competition. And his first one was a huge success, won the competition, and it was about the arts and the purification of morals. That we're not going to read because it doesn't have much to say about political philosophy. But he was thinking about this, and he was overtaken, he said, by a flood of ideas, 1,000 lights. And in fact, what Cohen doesn't say is that he sort of collapsed weeping on the ground because he knew that all the answers were there in this giant inspiration he's had, but he thought he'd never be able to express them all in words. So it's as if he'd got the answer to everything in a flash of inspiration, but he couldn't put it into words. So he's a very, very emotional person. As you can see, he had a horrendous childhood. His mother died in childbirth, I think. No, 2 days after his birth. And then his father abandoned him. And despite having all these very kind of liberal and progressive ideas about education, he had, I think, 10 children and abandoned them all at sort of orphanages, left them, a few days after their birth in a little bassinet on the doorstep of these orphanages because he couldn't support them, despite, of course, being successful in all these endeavors. So kind of crazy. Genius, but again, sort of crazy. And I was saying Hume invited Rousseau to come and stay with him and very quickly booted him out because he was just so obnoxious and paranoid and ranting and critical of this guy who's putting him up in his home, just savage. So you can kind of tell from various places throughout his writings that we'll read, there's these sort of kind of snide asides to this audience he sort of pictures reading his works and being critical about him. He said, "What do you want from me?" And he's not replying to anyone in particular. He's just replying to the sort of critics in his head. But there's no accident that he was a popular writer because he writes well. This is a different translation from what I'm used to. Of course, he writes in French, so I'm going to assume he writes well because I haven't read it in the French. My French isn't good enough. But there's some very famous phrases that Rousseau has introduced. So perhaps more than any writer, except maybe Machiavelli, who was also a very good writer, he's got some amazing phrases that have entered the lexicon. All right, so we're going to look at the Discourse of the Origin of Inequality. This was his second, having had this great success, winning the Academy of Dijon's essay prize with his essay on music and the arts. He entered again, and the question was, what is the origin of inequality? And his insight, as you shall see, is that it's all civilization's fault. Because so he's very much against the idea that you might find in modern capitalism, that capitalism just rewards excellence that is already there. That, for example, if you become rich under capitalism, this is the Mike Bloomberg idea, that if you become rich under capitalism, it's because you are deserving. You work hard and you are rewarded. So money is a badge of worth because you only got it because we're under capitalism. People don't have to give you money. So if they do give you money, it's because you did something good. And of course, we're living in an age that is perhaps the greatest inequality, certainly since the robber barons of the 19th century. And people defend this inequality, saying it's only just and right. It's reflecting differential worth. Rousseau says that's complete bullshit. That the inequality that we see in society is corrupt. It's both the result of prior corruption and it exaggerates. And the social institutions that, for example, Locke defends are a root of all evil, as it were. So Rousseau is often credited with introducing an idea, the idea of the noble savage, that humans in their most natural state, again, he refers to them as savages, which you might think is very denigrating term, very derogatory. But in fact, he sees humans in this state, as he presents it in this, as better than humans in the corrupted state that we find them in contemporary society. So people interpret Rousseau as saying that we would be better off in the forests. We'd be better off, living wild. The French intellectual giant Voltaire knew Rousseau. They knew each other. And on reading Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, he said something to the effect of, nobody has used so much intelligence to render us humans beasts. Reading you stirs in me a desire to go about on all fours. Because, of course, Voltaire was a major figure of the Enlightenment, which is the idea that civilization is what's lifted humans out of the mire, that we're getting better and better as our culture and our science. This is the age of reason, and reason is lifting us above the level of the beast. The more civilized we become, the closer to God, or the better we become. And Rousseau is looking at this idea and saying, no, you've got that ass backwards. We're just getting worse. Modern society is corrupting us. And that's the idea of the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality. Now, what's a central puzzle in Rousseau interpretation is that he then goes on to write the social contract, which seems to go against this idea. It seems because he suggests in the point of the social contract is to sketch out the terms of an ideal society, or the ideal organizing principle behind a society that will enable us to be the best we could possibly be, better than a savage man. So often people look at these two works and say, well, they just contradict each other. In the social contract, he's saying, in society we can be better than outside of society in the state of nature, whereas in Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, he presents society as a terrible disaster that befell humankind, and we would have been much better off if it hadn't happened. But I think you can actually reconcile these, and I think that's now probably the dominant interpretation, that they're not inconsistent. And I think he was actually writing both of them, the writing of both of them kind of overlapped. It's kind of like we saw in Machiavelli, when the prince seems to be arguing for monarchy, whereas in the Discourses he argues that the best kind of political system is not monarchy, it's a mixed system. How do you reconcile these two? And I think actually it's fairly possible with Rousseau. But let's talk about this tragically abbreviated version of the Discourse of the Origin of Equality that you have in Kant. I do want to talk a little bit about the preface that was cut off, because there's an important discussion in there that helps put the discourse into context. So remember, always bear in mind that this is part of an essay attempting to answer a question, where does inequality come from? Is it natural or is it artificial? That is, the Mike Bloomberg view, the capitalist view, that actually inequality is natural. So the inequality of wealth that we find in a capitalist society is perfectly justified because it just reflects inequality that was already there. Some people are smart, some people are stupid. The smart people use their smarts to get rich, so the money they get is a mark of their superiority. So in other words, on that view, inequality is natural, not artificial. Maybe it's worse than it would be, in a state of nature, but it still reflects what is already there. Of course, Rousseau's going to argue that no, inequality is entirely artificial. So, but if you're going to answer that question, then you have to have some idea of what we're naturally like. If we want to know whether or not this inequality is natural, what would it be to be natural? We have to have an idea of humankind's in their natural state. Sounds like state of nature, right? Now, of course, we've already seen versions of the state of nature in Hobbes and Locke. And in Locke in particular, the state of nature was very much something that could exist at any time in history. It was just the state of not having a judge appointed to settle disputes between two people. So remember, in Locke, the two rulers are in the state of nature with respect to each other because there's no sort of God figure or international judge to adjudicate disputes between the two. But of course, also in Locke, there's this view that there was a historical state of nature way back in the mists of history. And that's the kind of state of nature that Rousseau discusses here. It's very much, it reads like a sort of anthropological fairy tale. Like he imagines what could it have been like back in prehistory. Now, but of course, how does he know? Anybody could say, how do you know? You don't have a time machine. And of course, it's prehistory. There is no history of this event. So how can you justify any claims that you make? As he puts the challenge in the preface that you don't have, how will man be successful in seeing himself as nature formed him through all the changes that the succession of time and things must have produced in his original constitution, and in separating what he derives from his own wherewithal from what circumstances in his progress have added to or changed in his primitive state? In other words, he's saying we want to be careful, and something he accused his predecessors Locke and Hobbes of doing is looking at humans in society, in contemporary society, and saying, this is basically what natural man must be like. And Rousseau thinks that's a terrible mistake. A key concept in Rousseau is that your social circumstances change your very nature. This is something actually we saw a hint of in Machiavelli. Machiavelli said, there was all those discussions in Machiavelli of how difficult it is to subdue a free people, whereas it's easy to subdue a people that has been under a monarch because they're used to authoritarianism. They expect to be told what to do, whereas a free people who come from a republic, they're not like that. So, in other words, in Machiavelli, we get this idea that the very natures of a people are affected by their political institutions, political and cultural institutions. And that is a core Rousseauian idea. So, in other words, if you look at contemporary humans, you must, if you're to know what we're naturally like, you must be able to weed out the influences of our culture, how they've shaped us, from, it's basically nature versus nurture. How do you tell what's nature and what's nurture, what's in our cultural setting has produced in us? You know, for example, nobody disputes that our tastes, our culinary tastes, are a product of our culture. Americans are very queasy about eating bugs, for example, despite them being a wonderful source of protein. Whereas in other cultures, no problem. They'll eat fistfuls of maggots and have no qualms about doing it. Why? That seems to, when anthropologists point this out, that seems to suggest that what we thought was natural, you know, we thought that humans have a natural, Westerners thought that humans have a natural revulsion towards creepy crawly things and could never eat them. And then we find cultures where they have no problem with eating them. So clearly that's not a natural feature of us. Well, then how do you tell what is a natural feature of us? Rousseau says it's a problem, and he gives a good analogy of a weathered statue of Glaucus that looked like a wild beast. So you had this statue that had been exposed to the elements and it becomes weathered and gnarled, so that now it looks like a wild beast. It's us looking at humans in contemporary society and saying, oh, everybody's kind of pathetic and weak and riddled with social diseases. Oh, that must be what we're naturally like. You're making the same mistake as someone who looks at the statue of Glaucus after the centuries have eroded it and said that's what it always looked like. No, it used to be a noble statue, a thing of beauty. And by analogy, Rousseau thinks that us in our natural state were like that. We're much superior to the modern versions. Again, you can see why Voltaire, who was a champion of modern culture and modern civilization, would reject this idea. So that's a good background. Now, also in the preface that you don't have, Rousseau suggests that the human soul always had two principles that are prior to reason. Because one of the things that humans in their most basic, most savage state don't have is reason. You might say, we're almost subhuman, someone like Voltaire would say, but Rousseau doesn't see that this is a bad thing. In fact, he thinks that reason is definitely has as many bad things about it as it does good. He does, in the end, in Social Contract, decide that reason, when well used, is better than the absence of reason. It's just that he thinks in the society as he sees it around him, it's been corrupted. But the two principles that are prior even to reason in humans are self-interest, self-love. If you look in a very important distinction in Rousseau is actually in a footnote. So it's right at the end of the excerpt that you have on page 560. Footnote 2. He clarifies the difference between love of self, which is a positive thing, which is present in savage man, as well as in man in civilization, and amour propre, which is kind of a comparative love. It is your view of yourself as compared with other people that leads you to be jealous of other people, for example, if you don't and it's a source of pride and things like that. That, he thinks, is a byproduct of civilization, or one of the stages of civilization. And that's almost universally negative. But the original one, love of self, that's fine. That's like what leads to self-preservation. So you have that, savage humans have that, and they also have compassion, which is sort of love of the other. And we'll get to his discussion of that. But those two things are actually both positive drives that we find in natural pre-social humankind. If we understand that, he said, we shall not be obliged to make man a philosopher before he is a man. A philosopher, in that quote, which is in the preface, he's saying it's philosophers who use reason. And the mistake that, for example, Hobbes and Locke make is that they are a description of men in the state of nature who make the social contract. They're purely rational, particularly in Hobbes. They're like economic rationalizers of self-interest. They say, well, what's in our self-interest? I know, forming a society to lift us out of this state of war that we're in. Now, humans do reach this point, Rousseau agrees, but that's not their most natural state. They've already been corrupted by the time they reach that point. Prior to that, much earlier to that, they don't have reason. Oh yes, another thing in the preface is that Rousseau rejects the idea of natural law, or a law of nature. This is another very important distinction between him and the precursors, Hobbes and Locke. Both Hobbes and Locke talk about a law of nature. With Hobbes, as we saw, the status of the law of nature is a little vague. He doesn't really come down. Whereas Locke thinks that the law of nature is like the law of physics. It's something that you can anyone smart can discover, and it's sort of obvious to all. And he draws many conclusions from this, including the idea that essentially we have rights. We have rights because it's just self-evident that we have rights because of the law of nature, which is, according to Locke, a law of reason. So, of course, the fact that we don't have reason in our most natural state suggests that there isn't going to be a law of nature. And Rousseau has another point to make. He said, look, if the law of nature really was as self-evident as guys like Locke say, how come it is that all of these great philosophers throughout history who've talked about a law of nature all come up with completely different versions of it? If it's self-evident, they should all agree, right? Like everybody agrees about the laws of math. But every philosopher who writes on this comes up with something different. So not so self-evident, is it? Says Rousseau. So he's going to argue that he's not going to use a law of nature as a basis for drawing conclusions. He's got to come up with conclusions some other way. All right, on to what you actually have. So, part one. Part one is we're discussing natural or physical nature. I've skipped over one more thing. So that was the preface that you don't have. You also don't have the introduction to part one, which has a great quote in it, I think, where he talks about, he makes a distinction that he also makes in what you've got, that there's two kinds of inequality. There's natural or physical, which is differences in age, health, strength, mind, and so on. Remember, Hobbes said we're basically equal by those standards, whereas Locke said, no, we're very unequal physically. What we're equal in is moral equality. We all have an equal right to certain things. That's the equality that matters, according to Locke. So Hobbes and Locke disagree with each other, and Rousseau definitely sides with Hobbes on this one. That in the state of nature, remember Hobbes said in the state of nature we're basically physically equal, because even if there's someone stronger than me, I can kill him in his sleep. And Rousseau makes a very similar point, except it's in terms of how it's impossible to enslave someone in the state of nature, because you've got to go to sleep and they'll just run off. There are two kinds of inequality, natural or physical, or moral and political. Now what Rousseau is going to say is that we have neither kind of inequality in the original state of nature, and in fact we have both in civil society, because the artificial inequality actually has a kind of feedback effect, and it creates physical inequality that wasn't there before. So, for example, this is like when we find out that, in capitalism, the poor have much worse health prospects. And poor people in America have about 10 years shorter lifespan than rich people. Is this because they're naturally unhealthier? No, it's because being rich gives you access to all these resources that prolong your life and ensure you've had a healthy diet since you were born. You haven't had to live on McDonald's or stuff like that. And, so in other words, institutions exacerbate and perhaps even create natural inequalities that weren't there to begin with. Now, as I've said, as you will have gathered if you've read the Discourse, it sounds like kind of a fairy tale. It's this sort of speculative prehistory history. How literally is Rousseau expecting us to take this? Well, here's what he says. O man, of whatever country you are, whatever your opinions may be, behold your history, such as I have thought to read it, not in books written by your fellow creatures who are liars, but in nature, which never lies. And he explicitly compares his speculations here to the kind of speculations of astronomers who talk about, for example, the Big Bang. There are all these theories about the Big Bang. How the hell do they know? They don't know. They weren't around. This was billions of years ago. How can you know that the Big Bang happened? Well, the astronomers say, well, we look at what we can see now, like background radiation and stuff like that, and we work backwards to what must have been happening at the dawn of time. And Rousseau says, I'm doing a very similar thing. I'm looking at nature around me and working backwards and saying, what must we have been like in our earliest anthropological setting? There's a field of psychology that does something similar these days called evolutionary psychology. I happen to think that it's very dubious, but it definitely exists, and it seems to do a similar kind of thing. All right, so now finally we get to the parts that you've got. Assume natural man was physically similar to his current state. For example, he's bipedal. So notice that Rousseau is open to the possibility that humans were not bipedal, that they, as Voltaire put it, went about on all fours. So he's open to the idea of evolution, and this is in 1753. Rousseau pretty much ahead of the curve. Nature treats humans like Sparta did. Okay, this is on page 546, second column. I don't know if this is common knowledge anymore, but supposedly the children of Spartans are supposed to be incredibly tough. You may have seen 300 where they say, "This is Sparta." Spartans were supposed to be incredibly tough, and part of the reason for that was, supposedly, they put their babies out on the hillsides, and if they survived, then they joined society, and if they died, well, they were too weak to be Spartans. Now, of course, this is bullshit. No child would ever survive that, no human child anyway, but that's the story that was told about why Spartans were so tough, because they were exposed to the elements at a young age and, had to fight for survival. So that's the point of his analogy. That's what humans in their most natural state were like. So in our most natural state, we were incredibly tough. And he also believes, contrary to what Locke says, if you remember in Locke, Locke actually has some speculations about humans as part of the animal kingdom, and he talks about why human males stay with the females for much longer than in, for example, herd animals. In herd animals, the bull inseminates the cow and then just wanders off and never sees her again. And this is okay because the cow can feed herself by grazing. She doesn't have to hunt. Whereas in prey animals, the male will stay with the female because the female isn't able to hunt while she's caring for children. And Locke says humans are the same way. Whereas Rousseau says, nah, they weren't. The men would just leave, and the women would barely actually rear the children much. So literally like Sparta, the children were abandoned fairly quickly. And that there wasn't this sort of sense of familial love, the parental love in the state of nature. That only comes later. That's a later stage of our development, as we'll see. Now, illness. Was there sickness in the state of nature? Not really. He says, look at savage peoples. He often gives examples of savage people of the day, by which he means, pre-technological cultures that still exist. Like there are tribes in the Amazon still that are pre-technological in our terms. And what people say about them is they can run barefoot through the forest in a loincloth, and people like us would be dead in a week. We'd be bitten by everything poisonous. We wouldn't be able to go 5 feet without thorns sticking out of our tender, civilized feet. We just would die. Whereas they have no problem, and they don't. The extreme heat doesn't bother them, and the Bushmen of the Namib Desert, is it the Namib? In sub-Saharan Africa, they live in an environment that would definitely kill us within a week. There's no water around, but they know how to find this special route. There's an amazing old film called Animals Are Beautiful People. If you can find this, it's kind of an old-fashioned approach to documentaries. It's a color movie, but it was made by this South African filmmaker, the same filmmaker who went on to make a fictional movie called The Gods Must Be Crazy that was very successful in the 80s, also about the Bushmen. But one of the things that you learn from watching this documentary is that They can survive in the desert, one of the driest places on Earth, because they know how to recognize this tiny little twig, it looks like, that sticks out of the sand. And if they see that, they dig down and there's a root that looks like a giant potato, and you shave that and then you squeeze it, and a few drops of moisture come out of this, and that'll give you enough to survive if you're a bushman, whereas we would just die. So Rousseau says, look at these people. They're obviously much hardier than us. They don't get sick. They don't get depressed. That's another thing that he talks about, how people like Voltaire might say the state of nature, or Hobbes, for example, would say that the state of nature is a miserable place to be. And it's miserable. Nobody in the state of nature was miserable. Who commits suicide? People in societies commit suicide. Look at the suicide rate in Japan, one of the most civilized countries on earth. It's astronomical. Whereas who never even considers it is savage man. They would laugh at you at the idea of killing yourself. So who's more miserable, the people in society or in the state of nature? Illness. So even things like illnesses and sickness, he thinks are a byproduct of society, because we become weakened by the modern conveniences, whereas savage man, healthy as a horse, runs all day, doesn't bat an eyelid. He draws a comparison between wild animals and domesticated animals. Obviously, there's humans in the original state of nature are the wild ones, and the domesticated ones are like us in society. Only we're even worse, because domesticated animals don't make themselves weaker, but we do, by constructing social circumstances that make us fat and flabby and useless. Now, page 547. It appears at first view that men in a state of nature, having no moral relations or determinate obligations one with another, could not be either good or bad, virtuous or vicious. Hobbes basically said this, and Rousseau misinterprets Hobbes. He mentions Hobbes at the bottom of the second column on page 547. He says, because man has no idea of goodness, he must be naturally wicked. Hobbes doesn't say that. And certainly Hobbes didn't think it. Hobbes thought that humans in the state of nature were neither virtuous nor vicious, even though, of course, state of nature is a horrible place to be. Whereas Rousseau definitely thinks that they're not wicked. Let's see, 548, bottom of the first column, first mention of amour propre, and that refers to the distinction in the footnote on page 560, as I mentioned. Talk of compassion in the second column of 548, that's very important. That's the basis of all virtues. So Rousseau has it was very influential on Hume, who also had a similar theory. The idea that morality, insofar as there is a natural morality, or that morality is natural, it derives from natural human feelings of compassion, which Rousseau says other animals have too. Other animals don't like to see members of their own species in pain. We're just like that. And insofar as we are naturally moral, it's because of that. And that's good. I mean, so he has no kind of notion of morality, certainly in a state of nature, as being a reasoned intellectual process. You know, like, oh, that's wrong because I can't universalize my maxim, as, for example, Kant would say. Rousseau says, no, it's all about just feeling. And if we'd been left like that, we'd be better off than we are in contemporary society. And in fact, on first column of page 549, he talks about the negative effects of reason. And here it is reason which turns man's mind back upon himself and divides him from everything that could disturb or afflict him. It is philosophy, that isolates him and bids him say at sight of the misfortunes of others, perish if you will, I am secure. Basically, I'm all right, Jack. So it's only people who've been exposed to the use of reason that become callous, whereas natural humans will help each other out. Nothing but such general evils as threaten the whole community can disturb the tranquil sleep of the philosopher or tear him from his bed. So top of the second column on page 549. It is certain then that compassion is a natural feeling which, by moderating the activity of love of self in each individual, contributes to the preservation of the whole species. It is this which, in a state of nature, supplies the place of laws, morals, and virtues, with the advantage that none are tempted to disobey its gentle voice. So, remember the big discussion in Locke of, it would be great in the state of nature if we all followed the law of nature, which we're capable of doing, but we don't. So, Rousseau is saying, no, we don't follow, nobody follows the law of nature because they don't have reason. But it's okay, they're just naturally designed to feel compassion. So, where reason would say, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, compassion says, do good to yourself, that's the self-love part, with as little evil as possible to others, that's the compassion part. Now, not only do we not have reason in the state of nature, we don't even have very sophisticated emotions. Those are also developed later on. Now, with passions so little active, this is the last new paragraph on page 549, and so good a curb, men, being rather wild than wicked, and more intent to guard themselves against the mischief that might be done to them than to do mischief to others, were by no means subject to very perilous dissensions. So he's saying Hobbes's version of the state of nature certainly is not an accurate representation of our earliest state, because Hobbes says state of war at all, everybody trying to steal stuff from everybody else, so constant threat. And Rousseau says no, nobody's trying to steal anything, nobody wants anything, everybody has what they need. Their self-love will keep them cautious, and they don't like seeing other people in pain. So basically, nothing like Hobbes's state of nature. No concept of property, mine or thine. No sense of revenge. Even if somebody somebody attacks you, you won't seek revenge. You're I love this analogy, top of page 550. A dog will sometimes bite the stone which is thrown at him, as if the stone was the source of the problem. Because the stone hurts him, so he says, stop hurting me, and bites the stone, not understanding that it's the fault of the person who threw it. And he says savage man is like that. They'll kind of slap away someone who attacks them, but they won't pursue them afterward and say, I must take revenge, because they don't have any concept of that. Now, love. What love do people in this early state have? Here's a very important distinction, page 550, last new paragraph on the first column. Let us begin by distinguishing between the physical and moral ingredients in the feeling of love. The physical part of love is that general desire which urges the sexes to union with one another. This is essentially procreative lust. So people in the state of nature have that, otherwise the species would die out. They want to have sex. But the moral part is that which determines and fixes this desire exclusively on one particular object. So this basically might like monogamy, or falling in love with one particular individual. And Rousseau says that savages don't have this. They can barely tell each other apart, he says. So they have no attachments to individuals. Now, Rousseau doesn't see a problem with this, but you can imagine how someone says, well, that's terrible. One of the sweetest feelings is love between two individuals. And actually it does sound like he sort of agrees, because he will go on to say that when this second kind of love emerges, monogamous love, that we're in a better state. Now, he responds to a criticism, well, wait a minute, what about there are animals that do fight all the time, so why isn't that evidence for a Hobbesian state of nature? And he says, for example, fighting cocks, like bird fighting, that actually goes on sometimes Wasn't there an episode of Seinfeld where Kramer gets yeah, I think he does, a fighting cock, and he can't stand it because it's getting hurt in the ring. But yeah, there are these birds that will fight one another and cause great suffering. And he says, yeah, but humans wouldn't be like that, because one of the causes of dissension amongst the males of this particular kind of chicken is that the females don't want sex all the time, and there's also a very limited number. The relative number of males to females is there's many more males than females, so there's scarcity of females, and that brings about the dispute. But that doesn't happen with humans. Let's see. Okay. Good summary on page 551, first column. Let us conclude then that man in a state of nature, wandering up and down the forests, without industry, without speech, humans can't speak, and without home, an equal stranger to war and to all ties, no attachments, having neither standing in need of his fellow creatures, nor having any desire to hurt them, and perhaps not even distinguishing them one for another. Let us conclude that, being self-sufficient and subject to so few passions, he could have no feelings or knowledge but as befitted his situation. This is great. Oh, this is perfectly okay. It's a perfectly suitable way of being. Is there inequality? No. So this is all a build-up to show that there isn't natural inequality. Such a thing doesn't exist. If you look at humans in the state of nature, second column on page 551, it is in fact easy to see that many of the differences between men which are ascribed to nature, like that some men are strong, some men are weak, naturally strong, naturally weak, naturally smart, naturally dumb, that are ascribed to nature, stem rather from habit and the diverse modes of life of men in society. So even things like, Rousseau is saying, even things like your size or your strength, that's a byproduct of society. That's a byproduct of unequal resources, a history of inequality. It's like, I don't know, you see, I used to live in Los Angeles, and a part of Los Angeles is called Koreatown because there's a lot of Korean immigrants there. And when you stop shopping in the groceries, you would see tiny little Korean grandmothers accompanied by their giant Korean American grandchildren who had obviously been drinking milk since a very young age, and as a result were much larger and sort of more American looking than their grandparents. And that's exactly what Rousseau has in mind, that it's because of comparative poverty of the grandparents that they're smaller and so on. So in a state of nature, there's actually very little inequality. So in other words, it's clear that the inequality that we saw is not natural. And furthermore, in the state of nature, you can't even have oppression. And he talks about this in detail on page 552. That he tells a little story. Even if nature really affected in the distribution of her gifts that partiality which is imputed to her, in other words, if nature really made some people better than others, stronger, smarter, and so on, what advantage could the greatest of her favorites derive from it? Would that lead to the kind of exaltation? Can someone say, I'm smarter than everyone else, therefore I will have more power? And Rousseau says no. Even, first of all, nobody is really smarter than other people. That's the first point. But second, even if they were, they couldn't turn that into political or advantage or power. Because he says, what advantage could the greatest of her favorites derive from it? This is bottom of page 551. To the detriment of others in a state that admits of hardly any kind of relation between them. Where there is no love, of what advantage is beauty? Of what use is wit to those who do not converse, or cunning to those who have no business with others? I hear it constantly repeated that in such a state the strong would oppress the weak. Remember, that's part of the point of what Locke and Hobbes say. The strong are oppressing the weak, so it's in the weak's interest to form a society to protect them from the strong. Rousseau is saying, no, that's not even possible. Oppression would be violently domineering over others, but you can't do that, as he goes on to say. Try and do that to me when you go to sleep. I'm gone. I'm 20 yards off into the forest and you'll never see me again, he says. So you just can't even oppress. In a state of nature, so bottom of first column on page 552. Having proved that there's an important part just before that where he says slavery requires prior dependence. This is a very important point of Rousseau's. Rousseau has a horror of dependence on others. Dependence is the source of inequality, but also it saps you of your freedom. And he says the great thing about the state of nature is there is no dependence on others. You are completely independent. And it's only when you start to get dependence that oppression is possible. It is only when I am dependent on somebody that somebody can enslave me or oppress me. But in the state of nature, there's no such thing, so it's impossible. Having proved that the inequality of mankind is hardly felt and that its influence is next to nothing in a state of nature, I must next show its origin. Okay, so if it wasn't there in the state of nature, where did it come from? Given that it's obviously omnipresent, this inequality in Rousseau's time, how did it happen? So we get to the second part. And the second part begins with one of the best quotes in all of political philosophy, in my humble opinion. So here it is. The first man who, having enclosed a piece of ground, bethought himself of saying, "This is mine," and found people simple enough to believe him, was the real founder of civil society. From how many crimes, wars, and murders, from how many horrors and misfortunes might not any one have saved mankind by pulling up the stakes or filling up the ditch and crying to his fellows, "Beware of listening to this impostor. You are undone if you once forget that the fruits of the earth belong to us all and the earth belongs to nobody." So right there, he's saying that, if you remember, one of the things in his famous chapter 5 on property that Locke says that God gave the earth to all humankind in common. But Locke thinks that there is a way that you can amass private property. Rousseau says, no. You can never amass private property. Locke says there has to be a way without the consent of everybody. Otherwise, people would just starve. And Rousseau says, no, that's bullshit. You can always, of course you can eat things, but that doesn't mean you own them. So he sort of cuts off Locke's maneuver at the first stage. Now, having said that, he sort of qualifies it. But notice the important point is he doesn't think property exists in a state of nature. He does think that property exists. So like Hobbes thinks pretty much the same thing. Hobbes says there's no property in a state of nature either. But both what Hobbes and Rousseau would agree is that it's only when you set up a political and legal system that allows for property. Once you set up rules, those rules define a system of property. But as we shall see, the way this worked in practice was simply to reify the power of those who have already unjustly amassed large quantities before society. So the social contract as portrayed in Discourse on the Origin of Inequality is a trick played by the rich to protect their assets against the poor, who realized that the rich weren't entitled to them in a state of nature and were eventually going to take it back by getting sufficient numbers to overrun them. Now, so that quote is at the beginning of the second part, but it's sort of out of place because he then sort of winds back the clock because we haven't got to that stage yet. So it's a little confusing that he talks about property right at the beginning of this stage, but it is only applicable later on. So in this second part, so the first part is Rousseau saying essentially, let's look at humans in their most natural state. They are solitary. They're not a herd animal, so very much not like, again, not like Aristotle's idea that we're like the bees and the ants. Far from that. We are solitary creatures, like cats that sort of roam by themselves, occasionally bumping into others and procreating with them and then leaving immediately and not looking back. That's humans in their natural state, says Rousseau. Really? You know, it seems probably primatologists would dispute this. I think that sounds like gorillas. I don't know. There probably are primates that are more solitary than others, but I think the majority of primates are more cooperative than that. Anyway, in the second part, Rousseau then goes on to describe various stages of development. You might say it sounds almost like evolution, but we're not changing physically. We're changing spiritually, you might say. We're changing socially. So stage 1 is described basically from page 553, first column, and of course it's what he's described in the first part. So stage 1, as he describes it from page 553, column 1, to the first revolution at the bottom of 554, column 2, that's sort of the tail end of humans in their natural state. Then stage 2 is families. That goes from right at the bottom of 554 to the end of the first paragraph in the second column of 555. That's basically family. So stage 1 is solitary, stage 2 is families, stage 3 is tribal, small villages. That goes from first new paragraph on second column, page 555, to first new paragraph on page 557. And then that ends with the discovery of iron and corn, it says in this translation. Iron and wheat makes a lot more sense because wasn't corn discovered in America, and Rousseau's mainly focusing, I think, on Africa and Europe. But anyway, iron, metallurgy and agriculture are these twin discoveries that bring an end to the tribal and start stage 4. Now, stage 4 does sound like the state of nature of Hobbes and Locke, where things start to go seriously downhill, and it ends in a social contract to get out of it. But prior to that, things aren't so bad. So, stage 1 is where we have some adaptation to environment. So second column on page 553, people in this stage on the seashore invent the hook and line, become fishermen. In the forests, they make bows and arrows, become huntsmen. In cold countries, they clothe themselves with the skins of animals. So some adaptation to circumstances. There's a development of a kind of simple prudential reasoning. So the beginnings of reason happen here, bottom of page 553. The first traces of pride, because humans realize that they're better than other animals. Other humans are not yet of interest to them, really. Primitive language starts to develop here, which sounds like rooks or monkeys. It's more like grunting and squeaking. So he noticed, as actually the contemporary scientists are pointing out how smart rooks and crows are. And obviously he knew about this because they talk to each other. So, but the language, the primitive language that is developing towards the end of stage 1 is very primitive, not sophisticated. The end of this is brought about by the first inventions of tools and things like this, so that this is last paragraph on page 554. These first advantages enable men to make others with greater rapidity. In proportion as they grew enlightened, they grew industrious. They ceased to fall asleep under the first tree or in the first cave. They invented several kinds of implements of hard and sharp stones. They built huts. And that's what led to families, because now people could live in a family group in the huts. And page 555, the first expansions of the human heart The finest feelings known to humanity, conjugal love and paternal affection. So notice that it sounds like this is an improvement from our original solitary state, because we are developing these emotions that are wholly good, which is love of one's partner and one's children. But first problem comes along. Once we start living in huts, we get leisure. And this is the first yoke. A yoke being like, literally a yoke is the thing that you put oxen under to drag the plow. So if you put a yoke on yourself, it's like someone is using you, or it's like putting chains on yourself. So when he says the first yoke, this is a bad sign. The first yoke he inadvertently imposed on himself was the invention of conveniences. The tin opener. We have ruined our life with the invention of things to make our life easier, and you can imagine why. It's because it starts making us softer. We, in this stage, language progresses. We start to share cultures. So, and he mentions at the top of page 555, some groups, second column, some groups are geographically isolated, and that sort of leads to a kind of inbreeding and constant interaction, which creates communal culture for the first time. Before, we were like dispersed gas atoms that never bumped into each other long enough to form any kind of common culture. Now culture starts to develop. This brings about stage 3, which is small tribes. Stage 3, though, although it brings about some problems, the first major problem in stage 3, this tribal stage, is comparison. And this part always used to make my advisor Sharon Lloyd laugh. The first big problem was singing and dancing. So if you look on page 556, each one began to consider the rest and to wish to be considered in turn, and thus a value came to be attached to public esteem. People started to care about what others thought of them and wanted to be well thought of. It's like social media. Whoever sang or danced best, whoever was the handsomest, the strongest, the most dexterous, or the most eloquent, came to be of most consideration. And this was the first step towards inequality. As soon as you start comparing yourself, then the very notion of inequality gets a foothold. It leads to vanity and contempt and shame and envy, all of these emotions of self and other assessment. These emotions develop that didn't exist before, and some of them are negative. The notion of revenge develops here. Now, those are the bad things. The good things are morality, and the notion of punishments. Punishment's not necessarily so good, but morality. He says it's a happy medium between the indolence of primitive life. So he does admit that the very first stage, nothing was created. Whereas here we're making creations. We're kind of ingenious. But we haven't yet devolved into the worst stage. And if it hadn't been for a fatal accident, this would have been the best stage. He says, this period of expansion of the human faculties, keeping a just mean between the indolence of the primitive state and the petulant activity of our amour propre, must have been the happiest and most stable of epochs. The more we reflect on it, the more we shall find that this state was the least subject to revolutions, and altogether the very best man could experience. So that he can only have departed on it through some fatal accident. What was the fatal accident? The discovery of iron and agriculture. Metallurgy and agriculture, iron and corn. It was those ruined humanity. He says, it was iron and corn which first civilized men and ruined humanity. That's on page 557, first column. Because that led to specialization. Once you start industry, it requires specialization, and suddenly now, not everybody knows how to look after themselves. Prior to this, there was no specialization. Everybody knew how to catch food, how to grow food, how to cook food, how to care for themselves. They could survive as independent. So the only thing that they got out of others was comparison, but they didn't need others. Whereas the minute you become specialized, then some people only know how to hammer axes into shape. They don't know how to farm. They literally cannot live without others. Soon as you get dependent so that you cannot live without others, Remember, that's the source of slavery. Dependence is the source of slavery, and that's what the invention of iron and wheat brought about. Money gets invented. There's the labor theory of property, as mentioned on 558. About the last quarter of the first column on page 558. Thus, natural inequality unfolds itself insensibly with that of combination, and the difference between men developed by their different circumstances becomes more sensible and permanent in its effects, and begins to have an influence in the same proportion over the lot of individuals. Becomes a vicious cycle. You get rich and poor. Money has been invented. Insatiable ambition. This is like the lust for power after power that Hobbes talks about. This is where it develops in this stage, stage 4. And the wealthy have no sooner, first column on page 559, the wealthy on their part had no sooner begun to taste the pleasure of command, because they can afford to employ people and tell them what to do, because the people need employment, they need money, because they can't look after themselves, and they're forced into slavery, in effect, wage slaves. And the wealthy, having immediately acquire a taste for controlling people, because they themselves are also badly off, because they're dependent too. They're dependent on the people they employ. They can't live without their servants, much as the servants can't live without the money they get from their employers. The wealthy on their part had no sooner begun to taste the pleasures of command than they disdained all others and used their old slaves to acquire new, thought of nothing but subduing and enslaving their neighbors, like ravenous wolves which, having once tasted human flesh, despise every other food, and thenceforth seek only men to devour. This newborn state of society thus gave rise to a horrible state of war, just like Hobbes. Now, when this happens, bottom of first column on page 559, the rich in particular must have felt how much they suffered by a constant state of war, of which they bore all the expense, because they've got the wealth to lose, and in which, though all risked their lives, they alone risked their property, because other people didn't have property. So the rich are saying, this is pretty unstable. Yeah, I get to control people, but there are these bands of bandits roaming around who, if there are enough of them, they can take my stuff. It's a precarious situation. So, if you read the second column, page 559, it's the thought processes of the ingenious rich who say, how can we persuade people not to attack us? I know, we'll sell them on the idea of society by telling them the kind of American dream that everybody is equal under the law. Everybody's property is protected equally. Nobody's property is more important than others. But of course, they've got a lot more property, and all the poor don't have any property. So this system of property rights that the society rigidifies, makes real, benefits only the rich. So the social contract that sets this up is a trick by the rich, which cements them in the position of authority they have acquired, and now they have the entire force of the state on their side. So they're safe from the bandits because the police are on their side. So in other words, what Rousseau is saying is that modern capitalist society works to the benefit of the rich, and they set it up to do so. So it's like a conspiracy theory of the first order, but it's a very convincing one. So Rousseau is often pointed to as one of the forerunners of critics of capitalism like Marx, because he says that this supposedly super free system, like Locke is a huge fan of capitalists are a huge fan of Locke, because he presents this view of society as a system of just laws protecting people, that is to the interest of all. And if it wasn't to the interest of all, it wouldn't be legitimate. Rousseau is saying, like hell, it's to the interest of all. Not only is it to the interest of the rich, but also it sets up a system that tears us into an underclass who are perpetually given less and become worse and worse off, whereas the rich continually exploit them and their children have advantages over the poor. So we're becoming further and further apart, and it's all because of this system set up by the rich to their own advantage. So, such was, page 560, first column, such was or may well have been the origin of society and law, which bound new fetters on the poor and gave new powers to the rich, which irretrievably destroyed natural liberty, eternally fixed the law of property and inequality, converted clever usurpation, which is how the rich got rich in the fourth stage of the state of nature, was by usurpation, into inalienable right. So they got rich, and then they invented a system whereby that was perfectly okay, and in fact they had every right to their property. Because there's no real property in the state of nature. There's no law of nature that, unlike what Locke says, there's no law of nature that justifies you having property. You just have piles of stuff that you've managed to acquire it's not justified at all. You just were able to do it. And then you invent a system which says you're entitled to it. You're not naturally entitled to it. You're only entitled to it because the laws that you set up say you're entitled to it. So that's what he means. Converted clever usurpation into unalterable right, and for the advantages of a few ambitious individuals subjected all mankind into perpetual labor, slavery, and wretchedness. So the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality is an incredibly radical document. Unsurprisingly, it didn't meet with the same favor that his earlier Discourse had. He was very disappointed that the Academy at Dijon didn't look so favorably on this. I wonder why. Could it be that they were all wealthy people who thought that everything was great in the society and that they were good and they were generous towards the poor and giving charity to them, instead of, as portrayed by Rousseau, evil tricksters who oppressed the poor and told them that it was for their benefit? And of course, he goes on and says a bit more about how this leads us to, it's only when you set up nations that you can have wars. And, Hobbes says being in a nation is better than being in a state of nature. And Rousseau says, bullshit, the state of war isn't real war. Real war is war between nations. And has led to far more slaughter than the state of nature ever could. He said, more violent outrages in the sack of a single town than were committed in the state of nature during whole ages over the whole earth. So, very much a response to Locke and Hobbes, and seems to suggest that we're better off in the forests, which makes the social contract particularly surprising, because he argues in that you can set up a system whereby you're actually better off in society than you are in state of nature. But we'll get to that next time.